Good morning, Year 7, and welcome to Lesson 3 for History. And today we're going to look at the English Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries. So we're combining two things in one today. So there's quite a bit of information. It's a bit jam-packed. Don't worry too much. Just see how you get on. So we're going to look at why Henry split with the Catholic Church. We're going to look at the different reasons and start to put them into different categories and understand the reasons behind Henry's decisions. And we're going to look at why he decided what he did when he did dissolve the monasteries and what was the impact that had. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to pause the video in a second and have a look at putting these different things into the correct order. Okay, so they're not in the right order and the letters don't have anything to do with the right order either, so that won't help you. Okay, so just make a note of these things, and then in the links in the comments of this video, YouTube video, there is a link, and if you click on that link it will take you to a Horrible Histories clip, which is a historical desktop Henry VIII clip. I've put a picture of it on my next slide so you can see, but have a go, pause and write down these examples and then watch the clip and then try and put them in the correct order. This is the clip that you are going to be watching, so look out for that, have a watch and put those things in the right order and pause here. Let's see how you got on with that. I hope you enjoyed the clip. I do love a good Horrible Histories clip, as a lot of you who have had me know. I think it's brilliant. So if you are struggling, you're thinking, do you know what, I've got half an hour spare, I'm not sure what to do, why don't you watch an episode of Horrible Histories on BBC iPlayer and you'll feel so much better. And you'll have learned quite a bit as well. But back to the starter. So the correct order is Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in 1509. She then gave birth to their daughter Mary. Henry fell in love with another woman, Anne Boleyn, and decided he wanted a divorce from Catherine because she was quite old. Henry asked the Pope for divorce. He said no. Henry made himself head of the church. In 1533, Henry gave himself a divorce. Then Henry married Anne Boleyn, and in 1538, Henry ordered all Bibles to be read in English, not Latin. So let's go back through and digest all of this information. You've looked at medieval England this year quite a bit, and you looked at religion. We looked at the death of Thomas Becket. We looked at the struggle between power and religion. We've looked at how Britain was a very Catholic country and that religion was very important. People were quite scared of going to purgatory and going to hell and wanted to obviously do the best that they could. They'd pay money to try and resolve their sins, and we know that people had that big stance, and that continued into the Tudor period. So even in the 16th century, the 1500s, the Pope and his bishops were wealthy men who seemed to care more about money and power than about God. Some monks were known to be drinking and gambling. The Bible was written in Latin and very few people could understand this language. Therefore, they had to rely on the priest to explain it to them. Or, as you know, we looked at this year how they had stained glass windows in the church, and that kind of would sometimes put fear into people. And the church used people's fear of what would happen after they died to control them and make money. And not everyone was happy about this. There were, in the 1500s, some people speaking out against the church, not in England, but in Europe, in the Germanic states. And there was one guy called Martin Luther, and he was really unhappy with the Catholic Church and he didn't think it was good. He criticised that the church was too rich, that the priests were not being religious enough, that ordinary people couldn't understand church services, ordinary people couldn't afford to pay to have their sins resolved, and that wasn't fair. So there was a lot of people trying to get some changes at this time as well. It wasn't just a feeling that was happening across England. And as you know from last week, Henry was quite the religious person. Hopefully you saw on Instagram I put the picture of the pound coin so you could see that Defender of the Faith is still, and the Tudor Rose is on the pound coin even today. But he wrote a book against Martin Luther, who criticised the church, defending the Catholic Church and saying, you know, that actually he's wrong, it's not that bad, and he defended it. But also he was quite a religious man. You know, he sometimes went to church several times a day. So Henry was a really strong Catholic. So how have we gone from Henry being a really strong Catholic to suddenly splitting and, you know, reforming the church and moving away from Catholic England? Well, let's have a look. He married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, and Catherine of Aragon was actually married to his brother Arthur, who I think I did mention last week. And so when he married Catherine of Aragon, Henry was actually quite young. He was only about 17 when they married, and she was older than him. So there was always a bit of an age gap. And they were pretty happy married for nearly 20 years. Henry quite enjoyed her company. Catherine was really quite a skilled leader. She was a very good queen for Henry. Henry liked to fight a lot of wars and lost a lot of money from them, and she even helped. He was in France fighting a war, and even she came and sent an army to beat the Scottish army that had come when Henry was away, and she sort of gone into battle. So she was very good. There's a quite good Horrible Histories clip on that. So if you can find the Horrible Histories Henry special, it's all on there as well. But yeah, so they were quite happy married. They seemed to be getting on quite well. One of the challenges that Henry faced was that he desperately wanted a son. He wanted a male heir. We know from the War of the Roses that having a strong male heir, having a strong king to take on the throne and lead the country was really quite important. And Henry was desperate to have this male heir, to have this son, so that he knew that there would be a new Tudor king and the line would be secure. But in 1516, Catherine gave birth to a girl, and this girl was Mary, and Henry wasn't, you know, really quite sure about that, because there's never been a ruling queen, and to have a female ruler could be a bit of a challenge. Overall, Catherine gave birth to 6 children, but unfortunately the only one that survived was Mary, and this is where the cracks started to appear in their marriage. Henry wasn't happy. He wanted to then divorce Catherine, because he kind of was like, do you know what, she's too old now, she's a bit too old, she can't give me a son, don't want her, so I want to divorce her. Because he wasn't, you know, he killed a few of his wives, but he wasn't always horrible. And the Pope, who was the person in charge of the Catholic Church and in charge of Catholic marriage, said, no, you can't have a divorce. You know, we don't give divorces in the Catholic Church. And Henry wasn't happy with this, because he obviously wanted it. So he asked his lawyers to find out whether it could be happening, and it couldn't. And Henry didn't like the fact that the Pope had more power than him. So this also, as I've put in brackets here, kind of gave a little bit of a power struggle. So in 1531, Henry declared himself head of the Church of England. So he developed his own church. He broke away from the Catholic Church and said, you know what, that's no longer the church here. We're going to have the Church of England. And the Pope was furious, as you can imagine. He was not happy. And then in April 1533, he gave himself a divorce and he married Anne Boleyn. And he was pretty happy. Anne Boleyn was pregnant before they even got married, and she gave birth to girl. So obviously Henry wasn't particularly pleased. And when Henry declared himself as the head of the Church of England, he kind of went to the monasteries and said, look, I'm the new head of the church. And some of the monks were not happy. They did not support Henry's new church. And Henry decided, well, do you know what? If you're not going to support me, if you're not happy, I'm going to close them. Okay? Because actually about a third of the land is from the monasteries. They've got loads of gold, they've got loads of silver, they've got lots of materials to build them, and there's a lot of money to be had. So if we close and sell off the land, then Henry can make lots of money. Okay, so he decided, that's what I'm going to do, form the new head of church, and we're going to get rid of the monasteries. There are kind of like 3 key kind of reasons why he set up the Church of England. One, obviously to get divorced, one to make some money, and one to improve the church because of people like Martin Luther, and because, let's not forget, Henry was a really strong Catholic. He sometimes went to church 3-4 times a day. So to suddenly go, let's get away from the Catholic Church, which I've grown up with and lived for the past umpteen years of my life, there's going to be some, it's not all because of money and divorce. There's got to be reasons as well. Maybe he wanted to try and help develop the way that the church was. So what I'd like to do is I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like to have a go at sorting out these reasons into the 3 categories. So into getting a divorce, making money, and improving the church. Now I've put a colour code here because on my next slide I'm going to put them into the right order for you. So you don't, if you've got 3 colours, like 3 highlighters, that'd be great, or you can just write them out and put them into like a table and put the 3 categories onto the table and write the reasons like this if you want, but have a go at trying to sort those into those 3 categories and pause here. Let's see how you got on with that then. So I've colour coded mine to make it a bit easier for you to be able to see. So the first reason why Henry set up the church was to get a divorce. So Catherine of Aragon was too old to have any more children. Henry wanted a male heir to continue the Tudor name. That was obviously one of his big problems. Only the Pope could grant a divorce, and also one person had suggested that the best way to divorce Catherine was to set up a new church and rule, so that's what he did. Another reason why Henry set up the church was to make some money, and he made quite a lot. When he became head of the church, he made £1 million just by closing down the monasteries. Henry spent a lot of money on lots of wars, and so was very short of cash, and he sometimes gambled himself. He had 55 palaces, so to get more money was actually really good for him. Henry also spent a lot of money in France, so he needed more money, and the Catholic monasteries owned 1/4 of all the land in England. And then the final reason why Henry wanted to set up the Church of England was to also improve the church. Remember, he's really religious. He wanted to maybe make it better. So people felt that it was time to change the Catholic Church because they thought it was corrupt, and this was happening all the way across Europe, not just in England. Henry was a very religious man. He prayed a lot, so obviously his intentions surely would have been in the right place. A report claimed that Catholic monks and priests were breaking their vows of celibacy and poverty, which was unacceptable, and Henry also hated the fact that the Pope had more power than him and told him what to do. So this is kind of to do with improving the church, but also to highlight the power struggle that's still happening between the king and also the church. So this was known as, setting up the Church of England was known as the Reformation. And the Reformation is just a fancy word to say that Henry was reforming the church, or he was changing the church. Okay, so he did this. And then, because he didn't have much support from the monks in the monasteries, he decided that he was going to follow this up by closing all the monasteries. And when he closed the monasteries, this was also known as the dissolution of the monasteries. Okay, so the closing of the monasteries, or breaking up these monasteries, is what it was known as. And Henry closed the monasteries. This, I've got a picture here to show you. This highlights just an example of a monastery at the time. So you can see it's with the church, but they've got all this land for the monastery and all these different outhouses, all doing different things. So what did a monastery do? What is a monastery? We've probably talked about it a little bit this year, but let's go into a little bit more detail. It's where they would go, monks would pray 5 times a day, and they might invite other people from the public to pray with them. In the monasteries, monks promised to live an ordinary life. They worked really hard, but they didn't necessarily eat that much. And they would do lots of work on the land. So like, for example, where, you can't really see that, sorry. Like here might be a patch of land where they would grow lots of vegetables, and they might sell them to other people as well as eat them themselves. They were not allowed to marry. They had to copy out old manuscripts, so there was no computers or photocopiers or typewriters or anything like that. Everything had to be handwritten. So one of the big jobs that the monks had to do was to write out like books again and again, so that they could have copies of books. So like copies of the Bible would be handwritten by the monks. So they had quite a lot of power because they could, you know, they were the ones that were writing them. So it meant that they could also read and write. They employed lots of local people as servants or to help out, so they were, you know, an employer of all these people around in the areas over here. They would employ them and give them work, so they had quite a big role for their community. They were given large sums of money by landowners. and they gave money to local widows. So those that struggle to support themselves and their families, they would help give them money and support them. They also educated local children, because obviously they could read and write. They were there to help educate the local children, and they also had a really big role in feeding the poor. So the monasteries are really quite important. So when Henry dissolved them, when he broke them up, it had quite a big impact. And in 1535, Henry sent people to investigate the monasteries and to see if they were following all the rules, because he needed, obviously, he didn't want to just close them. He wanted to have a reason for closing them. And the rules of a monastery are just here. So monks should live as poor people. They can't marry or have sex. They have to look after the poor, sick and old. If someone was travelling and needed to stop for food and shelter, they should be able to give it to them. They should eat very simply, shouldn't really eat meat because that's expensive. Wear simple, rough clothing, sleep in dormitories with others on simple mattresses, help educate children, copy out precious manuscripts, and work hard growing their food and making what they need. Okay, so that were the rules, and they sent advisors to go and find out what was happening where, and to give a bit of an update. And he sent Thomas Cromwell, who was his chief advisor, to do this. And Thomas Cromwell went and investigated, and these are just a couple of examples of what he found out. So St Edmund's Monastery in Suffolk said, the abbot delighted much in playing at dice, and in that spent much money for his own pleasure, has had lots of beautiful buildings built. So this is clearly showing an example of the monks breaking the rules and not doing their purpose. In Chichester, the Abbey of Esselbourne and the Priory of Shawbread, because of their poverty, were not able to lodge us. We were compelled to ride out of our way to Waverley Abbey to lodge. So one of their key rules is they should give shelter to those in need, and they couldn't. So again, breaking the rules. However, this one says, I couldn't find anything bad about the convent. No matter how hard I tried, I believe I couldn't find anything, because everybody had got together and agreed to keep the convent secrets. But look at this, no matter how hard I tried. So they'd obviously been given strict instructions to go and find out what was happening in these monasteries and really find the negatives rather than the positives. And then finally, many of the monks devote themselves to hunting and other sports. The dormitory is so neglected that rain falls on the brothers' beds. The prior is frequently drunk. Again, not a good way for them to behave. And by 1539, there was not one monastery left. So they'd all been dissolved, they'd all been sold off and given away. And Henry earned an extra 1.5 million in total when he got rid of them. So he made an awful lot of money. So I'd like to have a go at answering these questions, and try and use some full sentences and a paragraph to answer them if you can. But first of all, what were all the reasons why Henry closed the monasteries? So think back on what we've gone through and discussed. Think about what I said about the rules of the monastery as well. You can use them as examples. Go back and pause on those slides. Who would suffer because of the monastery being closed? So think about, who do you think would suffer, and who would benefit from the monasteries closing? So who are the benefiters and who are the sufferers? And you could maybe say which was worse overall in total. And if you have the time, if it's not taking you past your full hour, or if you want, I've got an extension question as well. So if the monasteries closed, what would happen to the communities? What would happen to those communities around them? Okay, if they didn't have access to food, money, medical help, because the monks also provided medicine and clean and safe places for them. So they were like care providers. So what do you think the consequences would be like? And you could kind of summarise that maybe as like a person from the community who's suffering, and write it from their point of view, or you could just write it and list it, just a few notes on that. Okay, so hopefully you have learned quite a bit about the Reformation, about the dissolution of the monasteries. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully you've got the key bits from that. So the last thing I'd like to do is this plenary, so answer these 5 questions. These are all in your fact book, but I would like to have a go at answering them without looking, okay? And then at the end of the video, you can check and see if you got 5 out of 5, and if you didn't, don't worry, you've got a few, you've got another week, you can go through and check, and then I'll quiz you at the beginning of our next lesson. So what problems was Henry facing? What was the role of the monasteries? What was the dissolution of the monasteries? What was the Reformation? And which of Henry's ministers was behind the dissolution of the monasteries? So pause and have a go at doing this for the final part. hopefully everything's all right. Any issues, just drop me an email, Mrs. Edwards, and hopefully see you all soon. Take care. Bye.